Parashat Yitro is famously one of the two Sedras which tells us about the 10 Commandments being given from Mount Sinai. There's a big build-up. It's the third day, thunder, lightning, thick cloud, very loud horn blasts, trembling people, very dramatic, and actually probably quite a terrifying experience. A few weeks ago, we read in Parashat Shemot about Moshe's first revelation, the burning bush, the sneh, that Moshe comes across in the wilderness of Horeb while he's looking after his father-in-law Yitro's sheep. I read an article by Professor Rachel Edelman about the theory that the burning bush foreshadows the revelation at Sinai. So I would like to spend a few minutes looking at these parallels and then a few more on what I think these parallels teach us. Firstly, I should say that in many years of reading both of these stories, it had never occurred to me that Saneh and Sinai sound very similar. They have the same consonants, and that is significant in biblical Hebrew. There's even an explicit reference at the burning bush. God says, "V'hotziacha et ha'am mimitzrayim ta'avdun et ha'elohim al ha'har hazeh." When you take the people from Egypt, you shall worship God at this mountain. In other words, the revelation at Sinai. Rashi, the 11th, 12th century French author of the most comprehensive commentary on the Torah, says that the place of the burning bush is called Har HaElohim in the text, the mountain of God, because of what would happen there in the future. However, the Chizkuni, about a century later, also in France, says that Sinai is called so because of the miracle of the sneh, the burning bush. I don't know which way round, but clearly there is some connection. So let's look at these parallels. We have in the story of the burning bush, Moshe has had an encounter with Yitro, who gave his daughter, Tzipporah, to him in marriage. And we have in the story in the lead up to Mount Sinai, Yitro brings Tzipporah to Moshe. We also have in both the instance of the sneh and the revelation at Sinai, we start at an arrival at a place in the wilderness, the Midbar, and a mountain. At the sneh, we have Moshe haya ro'eh et hatzon. He was tending the flock of his father-in-law Yitro, Chotno, Kohen Midian, the priest of Midian, Vayinhag et hatzon achar hamidbar, and he drove the flock into the wilderness. Vayavo et el har haElohim choreva, and he came upon the mountain of God, Horeb. And we have for Sinai, and they, having travelled from Refidim, the Bnei Yisrael, Vayavo'u again, and the same word, Midbar, he came to the Midbar of Sinai, he came to the wilderness of Sinai. Sorry, they came to the wilderness of Sinai, Vayachanu Bamidbar, and they camped in the wilderness. Vayichan Sham Yisrael Neged Hahar, and they encamped there, literally against the mountain. In both cases, we have Moshe arriving with his flock to a place, a mountain in the wilderness. For the sneh, the flock is the actual sheep, and for Sinai, the flock is the children of Israel, who are very often referred to as the flock. In the Midrash in Shemot Rabbah 2:2, we hear a story about Moshe and a little lamb that goes missing from the flock. And he goes and he finds this little lamb drinking water in the shade by a stream. And he says, "Oh, I didn't realize you were so thirsty, you poor little thing." And he picks, and tired as well, and he picks up the lamb, puts the lamb on his shoulders and takes it back. And then God says, "Since you tend the sheep of human beings with such overwhelming love, by your life I swear you shall be the shepherd of my sheep, Israel." So we have that parallel there as well. In the story of the sneh, the bush is on fire and not being consumed. At Mount Sinai, the mountain was smoke, because God had come down on it in fire. And in fact, in next week's Sedra, Mishpatim, when Moshe goes up Mount Sinai for the whole Torah, for the tablets of stone, God appears ka'esh ochelet b'rosh hahar, as a consuming fire on top of the mountain. And Moshe disappears into this, but he is not consumed. He comes out after 40 days and 40 nights. We also have an aspect of clothes and purity. Moshe had to remove his shoes from the burning bush because it was holy. The place was holy. And we have the holiness of Mount Sinai, and the Bnei Israel had to wash their clothes. And we have a theme of looking at God. Moshe had a desire to look at the bush, but he hid his face because he was afraid. And we have the Bnei Israel also could not look at God. We have also humility. Sneh was holy. Sinai was holy. We have the Gemara in Sota 5a says, Rav Yosef says, a person should always learn proper behavior from the wisdom of his creator. As the Holy One, blessed be he, disregarded all of the mountains and hills and rested his divine presence on the lowly Mount Sinai. And similarly, when appearing to Moshe, he disregarded all of the beautiful trees and rested his divine presence on the bush. And in fact, Moshe is described as Anav Mikol Ha'adam Asher Al Pnei Ha'adamah, the meekest of all men who were upon the land, on the earth. So what do we make of these similarities between these two events? There definitely seems to be a foreshadowing, but it's more than a foreshadowing. Rav Chanoch Waxman of Yeshivat Har Etzion says that what happened to Moshe as an individual at the Sneh is what would happen to the Bnei Israel at Sinai as a communal experience. A link to that in Shemot Rabbah 2:5, it talks about the bush being in a flame of fire to embolden him, Moshe, so that when he comes to Sinai and sees the fire, he should not be afraid of them. So it was to prepare this humblest of men for the greatest revelation, Sinai. So we have one similarity, but actual difference in the two events that I'd like to look at. And that is when Moshe is given his instructions at the burning bush to tell the elders of the children of Israel that God will take them from slavery into a land flowing with milk and honey. He says, Moshe says, what if they don't believe me and don't listen to me? V'hein lo ya'aminu li v'lo yishma'u b'koli. And at Sinai, this is rebuffed. And God says, I will come to you in a thick cloud, in order that the people may hear when I speak to you and also believe you forever. Ba'avor yishma ha'am b'dabri imach v'gam b'cha ya'aminu le'olam. So we've still got that listening and believing. And ya'aminu is not a very common phrase. It doesn't come up a lot, but it does come up these two times. So the Sneh was maybe a preparation for Moshe for the task ahead. So much of the revelation at the Sneh materialized over the time running up to and including the greatest revelation at Sinai. These two events, the Sneh and Sinai, sandwich Yitziat Mitzrayim, the leaving of Egypt. So, this Sneh appears and only appears in Moshe's first revelation and his biggest revelation, and what I don't have time to cover today is actually his final revelation when he is blessing the tribes of Ephraim and Manasseh on his deathbed. The Sneh is humble, Moshe is humble, but then Moshe achieves great things and the greatest revelation of all, as I've said, Mount Sinai. I want to look at one more event and pull it together. The only other time besides the burning bush that Har HaElohim, the mountain of God, is mentioned is the story of Elijah's vision when he is fleeing Jezebel, having proven that Baal is not the true God. He's despondent and the people have forsaken the covenant. He alone serves God, and his life is in danger. And I will read from the text. Come out, he called, and stand on the mountain before the Lord. And lo, the Lord passed by. There was a great and mighty wind, splitting mountains and shattering rocks by the power of the Lord. But the Lord was not in the wind. After the wind, an earthquake, but the Lord was not in the earthquake. After the earthquake, fire, but the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire, a still small voice. Kol demama daka. So there are so many comparisons to this in the life of Moshe, with fleeing for one's life, coming across Har HaElohim Chorev, even 40 days and 40 nights, both spent on the mountain, and the fire on the mountain. I think this link shows that God is in the mountains, but he's also in that small, humble bush. He's not just in the fire, the thunder, the majestic, supernatural events, but he's in that small, humble bush, the still, small voice, and everywhere around us. And also sometimes God is preparing us for challenges that we can't always foresee. We don't always appreciate that preparation, but we should try and learn from every situation, however humble. Shabbat Shalom.